Good evening. You're watching World News Tonight on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Ukraine's top spy, Kyrylo Budanov, has a new job tonight as the chief of Vladimir Zelensky's presidential office after a corruption scandal forced the resignation of Andriy Yermak late last year. In just a moment, we'll go live to our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Chatterjee. But first, the latest headlines. Ukraine warns the Kremlin is planning a major false flag operation. Sanctioned Russian steel is found on board a Shadow Fleet vessel seized by Finland. And President Donald Trump says the United States is, quote, locked and loaded if protesters are killed in Iran. The head of Ukraine's intelligence agency, Kyrylo Budanov, will take over as Vladimir Zelensky's top aide more than a month after Andriy Yermak was squeezed out amid anti-corruption raids on his home and office. Budanov has been tipped as a potential rival to Zelensky if elections are held and credited with some of the war-torn country's most advanced covert operations in Russia. For more, let's go live to Kyiv, where our correspondent Oz Chatterjee is standing by. Good evening, Oz. What does Mr. Budanov's appointment mean for Ukraine?
Well, as you rightly pointed out, Aaron, he is considered a rival to Zelensky, mainly because of just how popular he is. He's one of the most recognizable figures in the military side of the administration, and has been responsible for many of those daring raids into Russian territory, those attacks on the Black Sea fleet in the around the occupied Crimean Peninsula. But it's important to note that this is an intelligence professional now moving to the world of politics, where he'll be becoming Zelensky's chief of staff, and he will be dealing with a different world than he's been used to of dealing with the intelligence services. Now, President Zelensky says this is an opportunity for the president's office to refocus on security and defense, looking forward to 2026. President Zelensky on Friday, following the appointment, released a statement about this. Here's what he had to say.
I had a meeting with Kyrylo Budanov and offered him the role of the head of the office of the President of Ukraine. At this time, Ukraine needs greater focus on security issues, the development of the defense and security forces of Ukraine, as well as on the diplomatic track of negotiations. And the office of the President will primarily serve the fulfillment of these tasks of our state. Kyrylo has specialized experience in these areas and sufficient strength to deliver results. I also instructed the new head of the office of the President, in cooperation with the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine and other relevant leaders and institutions, to update and submit for approval the strategic foundations of our state's defense and development, as well as the subsequent steps.
Now, Budanov is heading into a new position. This is going to be an interesting development for Ukrainian politics. As I said, Budanov is very media-savvy, charismatic, young. He's only 39, and he'll be heading up a very, very influential role in the president's office. Andriy Yermak, his predecessor, who stepped down at the end of last year following the probe by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau into the state-owned nuclear power agency Energoatom. And Yermak was frequently criticized for being too powerful, wielding too much power in the president's office. So it'll be interesting to see how Budanov operates in this role. Now, it is all change in the president's office, but it's also all change in the offices behind me at the HUR, that's Ukraine's intelligence agency, where Budanov served as the chief since 2020. Now that's going to be taken over by Oleg Ivashchenko, formerly from the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine. Now will be heading up the HUR. So all change in this cabinet reshuffle here as Zelensky shakes up his top team. And it's going to be interesting to see how this career intelligence professional now operates at the head of Zelensky's administration. But another thing, Zelensky's been under domestic pressure for quite some time now. So this move may be a canny political move to tie one of his potential rivals now to the successes and failures of Zelensky's office, particularly as we head into a quite critical moment of negotiations between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia. Back to you, Aaron.
Much to watch. Our correspondent Oz Chatterjee in Kyiv, thank you. Staying with Ukraine now, where Kyiv's Foreign Secret Service is warning of a planned high-casualty attack staged by the Kremlin inside Russia to derail any peace negotiations. It comes after a week of unverified claims from Moscow, including that Ukraine was to blame for New Year's strikes in the occupied southern Kherson region and an alleged attack on Vladimir Putin's residence. Michiel van Blomenstein reports.
The new year in Ukraine started as the previous one ended, with Russian strikes on civilian targets. In this case, a shopping mall in the Zaporizhia region. But not all was the same, as Russia blamed Ukraine for a strike on civilians celebrating New Year in the occupied part of Kherson. The claims have not been independently verified. But they closely follow Moscow's since-debunked allegations that Ukraine attacked Russian leader Vladimir Putin's residence in Novgorod using drones. Such claims represent a strategic shift.
I assume that the reason they're doing it now is because they fear that President Trump may be close to a kind of final offer peace deal. So they must be really panicking that they may actually lose the chance to derail the peace talks with Donald Trump.
Trying to influence Washington this way follows a year of unsteady Ukraine policy coming from the White House. As described in an extensive report by the New York Times earlier this week, two camps within the administration are at odds. One, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, wants Ukraine to make far-reaching compromises to Russia. Other officials adhering to this line of thought include Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and especially his Undersecretary for Defense Policy, Elbridge Colby. On the other side of the aisle, advocates of continuing aid to Kyiv include Foreign Policy Chief Marco Rubio, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and the now marginalized Special White House Envoy to Kyiv, Keith Kellogg. The main linchpin between the two ideological camps remains President Trump, who, according to the report, has been flip-flopping between the two sides. Experts say it's something that European and Ukrainian diplomats are seeking to leverage to the fullest.
Donald Trump is a weather vane. He spends according to the last person who talked to him and according to what he thinks will profit Donald Trump. So they have to maintain the diplomatic talks. They have to flatter Trump while getting to the adults in the room in the United States.
But the Kremlin is also well aware of the Trump administration's whimsical nature. And Kyiv now fears Moscow might be upping the ante. According to Ukraine's counterintelligence service, Russia is preparing a false flag operation where the Kremlin will blame Ukraine for some atrocity.
The Kremlin is preparing a large-scale provocation with human casualties. The expected time is on the eve or during the celebration of Christmas according to the Julian calendar. The place of provocation may be a religious building or other target with high symbolic significance both in Russia and in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. To falsify evidence of Ukraine's involvement, it is planned to use fragments of Western-made strike UAVs, which will be delivered to the place of provocation from the front line.
It's unclear whether Ukrainian fears of a Russian false flag operation will come to fruition. But it would not be the first in the post-Soviet era that Russia would try such tactics. From the 1999 Moscow apartment building bombings as a pretext to invade Chechnya, and claiming separatism to attack Georgia, to the 2014 invasion and forced annexation of Crimea, modern-day Russia has deployed false flags before.
So it's definitely part of their repertoire. And the fact that they are talking, or the Ukrainians are saying there's chatter that this may be coming, I think does illustrate my main argument before, that Russia sees this as a turning point.
Thank you. For TVP World, Michiel van Blomenstein.
And we'll break all of this down with James Batchick, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre, later on World News Tonight. A ship suspected of cable damage in the Baltic Sea and seized by Finland has been revealed as carrying sanctioned Russian steel. That's according to local authorities, who say the vessel was sailing under the flag of Saint Vincent and Grenadines and heading from Russia to Israel. Kazimierz Wyszek reports.
This is Fitberg, the ship seized by the Finnish authorities in the Gulf of Finland earlier this week. It's suspected of cutting underwater communications cables between Finland and Estonia. And if that's not bad enough, the Finnish Customs Service has revealed the ship has sanctioned Russian steel on board.
Preliminary information indicated that the cargo consisted of steel products originating in Russia, which are subject to extensive sanctions. Import of such sanctioned goods into the EU is prohibited under EU sanctions regulations.
The Finnish authorities are now looking into whether they can even charge the ship's crew over its cargo, since it wasn't trying to offload it in Finland. In fact, it's going to be a challenge to bring charges against the crew at all, even over the suspected cutting of cables.
The difficulties of attributing responsibility and also establishing intention of damaging something can be quite complicated, as can be the jurisdictional questions.
This is not the first time that Finland stopped a ship suspected of damaging underwater cables. Eagle S was seized by the Finnish Coast Guard just over a year ago for a similar offence. But in its first ruling in October, the Finnish court had to admit it had no jurisdiction over the case, since the vessel started dragging its anchor on the seabed in international waters. That's why European countries are now searching for ways to be more effective when dealing with the shadow fleet.
Well, one proposal that has been coming up a bit more than before is perhaps trying to have an impact on changing international maritime law. But of course, that route is quite slow. It will take a long time.
Before there is progress on that front, the Finnish Coast Guard has no choice but to operate in reactive mode. When an underwater cable is damaged, they're sending in this patrol boat. I was able to experience firsthand how it operates just 3 weeks before it seized the Fitberg vessel. While it's certainly impressive, these officers are often held back by international law.
As a coastal state, we are not intervening as a general rule in international waters. Our task is to be prepared from the point of view of our legal tasks.
Russia is estimated to be earning between $8 to $9 billion annually from selling just sanctioned oil using the shadow fleet. This money is then used to fuel the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Wyszek.
US President Donald Trump is tonight flexing his military might, warning Iran that Washington is ready to step in if protesters are killed. As Natalia Komarov reports, at least 8 people have reportedly already died in the mass demonstrations over the country's rising cost of living.
When shopkeepers in Tehran went on strike over skyrocketing inflation last week, they probably didn't expect that within just a few days, the situation would snowball into nationwide riots. Protesters have been filmed breaking into government buildings and starting fires. Many Iranians, especially the youth, have been protesting the Islamic regime for decades now, with the biggest protests having taken place after a young woman, Mahsa Amini, died in police custody in 2022.
Each time, unfortunately, the government tried to use the forces to saturate the protesters. But I believe recently the government's approach is somehow changed.
The economic situation in Iran has been worsening due to international sanctions. Now the Iranian currency rial reached its historic low. President Masoud Pezeshkian accepted responsibility for the people's economic woes.
People are dissatisfied. We are at fault. It is we who must find a way and solve the problem. It is we who must make the effort and find solutions to these problems for them.
However, this appeasement rhetoric is contrasted by near-complete blackout of internet and cell signals across the country. Local authorities reported several deaths caused by rioters clashing with police.
At the moment, there is no leadership, no coordination between various groups of the protesters. So the government is able to pacify, to crack down single groups of protesters.
US President Donald Trump has threatened to intervene.
If Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go.
This just days after he confirmed his willingness to use the US military might to disrupt Iran's potential nuclear program, as Tehran's greatest foe, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was visiting the White House.
Now I hear that Iran is trying to build up again, and if they are, we're going to have to knock them down. We'll knock them down, we'll knock the hell out of them.
The Iranian government responded to Trump's threats.
Trump should know that U.S. interference in this internal matter would mean destabilizing the entire region and destroying America's interests.
For many inside Iran and around the world, every protest brings hope that Tehran's theocracy could fall. And while for Washington and Tel Aviv it would be a reason to celebrate, one capital would mourn: Moscow.
Russia is absolutely desperate for the current regime to stay in power. Because with that regime disappearing, then Russia is would be losing a major ally in the region. Russia has already lost one very important ally in the region, meaning in Syria.
Iran has been providing Russia with Shahed drones used to attack Ukrainian cities. But as demonstrated by the events in Syria in late 2024, the Kremlin cannot spare troops to aid Middle Eastern allies. One thing is certain: young Iranians overwhelmingly reject the current regime. Now, will it fall or adjust? For TVP World, Natalia Komarov.
Anyone who opposes the will of the Hungarian people can expect the most serious consequences. This from opposition leader Péter Magyar as he pushes for power in April's high-stakes parliamentary election. In fact, Magyar appears to be the first politician in 15 years that could end Viktor Orban's rule, with his teaser party leading most independent polls. Piotr Mischuk explains.
In Hungary, 2025 was a year of opposition demonstrations against banning the annual Pride March in Budapest, demanding better healthcare, or in protest against a crackdown on the media and NGOs. Social discontent morphed into a major challenge for the ruling party Fidesz and Prime Minister Viktor Orban.
Like a miracle, the TISA movement rose up. Now there is hope that there is only one contender against the state party.
TISA, officially registered in 2023, has now taken the lead in most independent polls ahead of the parliamentary elections in April. Throughout 2025, the opposition party gathered steam in the electoral race with Hungarian MEP Péter Magyar at the helm. The politician consistently spoke out against Orban, taking him to task for his authoritarian-style rule.
He himself built a system in which power is centralized, the press is under control, and the country is ruled by fear.
In his New Year's speech, Magyar cautioned against attempting to unfairly influence the election results in any way.
Anyone who opposes the will of the Hungarian people in any way, be they the President of the Republic, a Secret Service agent or a constitutional judge, and participates in a constitutional coup, can expect the most serious consequences.
Although the pro-European Magyar is against sending Hungarian troops to Ukraine and said his country's process of cutting energy ties with Russia will not be quick, he might be the respite many European leaders have been hoping for, given Orban's reluctance to help Ukraine, including his opposition to the €90 billion EU loan granted to the war-torn country last month.
I think it was an extremely bad decision, which brings Europe closer to the war. It looks like a loan, but of course the Ukrainians will never be able to pay it back. So it's basically lost money.
And Orban's ties with Russian President Vladimir Putin were yet another reason for a wave of anti-government protests in the country. Amid dampening support in the country's stagnating economy, Orban, who has served as the country's prime minister since 2010, has stepped up domestic efforts to win back voters. The government has now offered a pension top-up.
This group, people above the age of 65, is already the strongest base for the government. They tend to vote the government party.
The Prime Minister is in a race against time.
There are many measures, and they certainly have some impact, so they increased somehow the public perception. But the problem is that it's still negative, and it can be changed dramatically in a few months.
With the election approaching, Hungarians can now expect the ruling Fidesz party to up their game. The opposition TISA party can only hope to avoid the fate of a broad alliance called United for Hungary, whose landslide defeat in the 2022 election gave Orbán 2/3 of the seats in parliament. For TVP World, I'm Piotr Miszczuk.
And joining me now is James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
So, a new Chief of Staff for Volodymyr Zelensky. What does this tell us? The appointment of Kyrylo Budanov, Ukraine's top spy, what does this tell us about the appointment to him leading the office of the president?
Well, I and many other analysts I speak with think this is quite a strong choice. It shows the trust that President Zelensky is putting into Budanov to translate his previous military successes into this new role. Budanov has earned trust not just in Ukraine, but also with many Western allies by being immensely capable. He has overseen and expanded Ukraine's foreign intelligence and military operations against and in Russia with this war against Ukraine. In particular, he's quite adept at making an impact with the limited tools available in the war where Ukraine has been outgunned and outmanned frequently. He's been in the middle of the kind of daring asymmetric successes, for example, with the attacks in Russia earlier, or the incident in the Kerch Strait Bridge. But all of these together show that he's really a capable handler of these complex tasks, which are strengths that will probably come in handy when he's managing the many challenges facing the Zelensky administration right now. But beyond just the management, I think he also has relevant experience to diplomatic negotiations, including, for example, with prisoner exchange negotiations in the past. And I think it would behoove Ukraine to see him in the negotiations with the Americans to come.
You rightly point out that this is a guy understood to have spearheaded attacks, for example, in the heart of Russia, particularly some of those covert advanced attacks and operations. He's also kept close ties, reportedly, with the United States. Are we seeing President Zelensky doing everything he can to keep Donald Trump on side and to keep Vladimir Putin's influence away from the White House?
Oh, certainly, yes, without a doubt. This is a continued effort to keep the United States, and in particular Donald Trump, on side. That consideration impacts just about every decision President Zelensky makes, including this one to elevate Budanov. We've seen recently Zelensky has been working overtime to appeal directly to Donald Trump, especially as Putin continues to try to poison the relations between the two and the entire peace negotiation process that has unfolded in the last few months. And as you mentioned, Budanov's relationship with the West, he also has a relationship with some of the most impressive feats Ukraine has achieved in the war, and Donald Trump has reportedly been quite fascinated with them. So I think Budanov could be well situated to work with the Americans in this U.S. administration going into the future.
You used the words there, poisoning. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin, because in recent days we've heard Russia claim that nuclear missiles are on their way to Belarus. We've heard claims that Ukraine attacked Putin's palace in Novgorod, which the CIA has, of course, dismissed. We've also seen those claims around the strikes in Kherson. Is the Kremlin desperately trying to shift responsibility for these peace negotiations failing?
Yes, they definitely are. And really, this is just more of the same from Putin and from the Russians. We've seen this to be the case with just about every single peace effort Donald Trump has initiated since coming into office early last year. We've seen Putin get on the phone with President Trump before his planned meetings with Zelensky to try to paint the Ukrainians as the ones that are standing in the way for peace, and then the Russians are the ones who really have the appetite for peace. But then the Russians, for example, will launch 200 drone strikes against the Ukrainians during this process, or they'll make these claims that the Ukrainians targeted one of Vladimir Putin's residences, as you mentioned, despite the fact that, rightly so, that the CIA has completely dismissed this, and even it looks like the Russians have overstepped here. Donald Trump shared a editorial piece on his Truth Social account, showing that, or writing that this attack was invented or embellished. That the Putin in Russia has no interest in peace. But then look at the larger picture. Look at the two competing statements from Putin and Zelensky and their New Year's Eve statements. Zelensky talked of peace, and he's the one who actually shows up time and time again in Washington, in places in Europe, to talk about getting to peace. Look what Putin says at his New Year's resolution, New Year's Eve speech. He talks about taking more of Ukraine and continuing the fight. I don't think that's the Russians showing that they're ready for peace at all.
There's another piece of the puzzle here too, of course. As we go to air, we're hearing these Ukrainian intelligence reports that Russia is preparing a large-scale provocation, including human casualties, to disrupt any further ceasefire talks. How seriously should the West take these kinds of warnings that the Kremlin could manufacture an incident in Russia and blame Ukraine?
Well, I think they should be taking these seriously, and I think fundamentally, these actions we're seeing from Russia, this increasing rhetoric, is trying to regain the initiative. They're very unlikely happy with the process of the negotiations, and it looks like the Americans and the Ukrainians are increasing on the same sides with the negotiations. I would suggest that these are a signal from Moscow that it wants to be taken seriously. It wants to have these negotiations move in a different direction, and it will do things like stage attacks on one of Putin's residences, or call up, as you say, a potential attack and a false flag attack. Keep in mind, that's also how the Russians wanted to start their invasion of Ukraine in 2022 in the first place. It wasn't until the U.S. government released intelligence saying that a false flag attack could be likely as a means or casus belli for the Russians to invade Ukraine. So I would take this very seriously, and I would read into it the Russians not wanting to see these peace talks succeed.
I guess the question is then, could such tactics work? I mean, we've talked about Donald Trump. You mentioned Donald Trump having these conversations with Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump is widely regarded as someone who's usually swayed by his last contact or even his last phone call. I mean, could he be convinced to believe Moscow over Kyiv?
Look, I'm not going to speculate too far. It is true that there's the common refrain of Donald Trump listens to the last person who is in the room. He was apparently quite irritated. The last year has proven that it's a possibility, right? That President Trump takes Vladimir Putin at his word. I think so, but then most recently, look at this post that Donald Trump shared from the New York Post editorial, showing that they called the attack a false flag, and Donald Trump seemed to suggest that he agreed with that position. So I do think, yes, Donald Trump is highly mercurial. He does change his tune frequently depending on who he talks to, but I think there is an upper limit there. I would be concerned about any sort of action and where Donald Trump falls, but I do think that there is not enough. There is options on the table besides just the fatalistic one.
Now, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but speaking of President Trump, it's now been almost a year since he returned to office, of course, promising initially to end the Ukraine war in one day. He now says we're 95% of the way there. But in your view, has Donald Trump, who's this self-acclaimed man of business, of numbers, failed by his own metrics?
Well, I think that's a tough measure, partly because the metrics change so frequently with President Trump. You'll hear him talk about these 2-week intervals frequently. It is true that he said, I believe, he was going to solve the Ukraine issue in one day, no fewer than 80 some times when he was on the campaign trail, but has later come to say that this is a complicated one. So I do think he has found that this issue is much more difficult to solve than he probably initially anticipated. However, I think that the best case is a negotiated settlement that the Americans and the Ukrainians jointly agreed to. So I think anything to get us to that goal would be a metric of success.
James Batchick, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And that's all for World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for more. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.